Historians of Reddit, what commonly accepted historical inaccuracies drive you crazy? Albert Einstein did not fail mathematics in school, as is commonly believed. Upon being shown a column making this claim, Einstein said, "I never failed in mathematics. Before I was 15 I had mastered differential and integral calculus. Thanks a lot, now I have no excuse for failing my pre-cal class." I'm not a historian, just Mexican, and let me just say that Cinco de Mayo is not Mexican Independence Day. First, that Roman gladiatorial battles were bloodbaths with like 30 men dying in one fight. I read something very recently saying that 1 in 200 fights ended in killing. Gladiators are freaking expensive and you don't just get them killed when a man was injured. Fight over. Second, that Nero played the lyre and sang while Rome burned. He was in Antium and hurried back to Rome. Source: Tacitus. The ye and ye olde is actually abbreviated as an early modern English letter called thorn that was pronounced like th, so it's pronounced more like our the oldie than anything else. Also because Gutenberg's printing press didn't have thorn, so they improvised with y. That Paul Revere actually staged a midnight ride and was the only one who did so. He actually went from lodge to lodge warning people, then got his butt arrested, and then escaped later on in the night. That most of the slaves in the triangle trade ended up in the USA. Wrong, just plain wrong. The majority of slaves shipped from Africa ended up in South or Central America or the West Indies. Just to add to this, so many slaves were shipped to the West Indies because it was cheaper to work current slaves to death and just replace them rather than give them even a substandard quality of life. That Rosa Parks just decided one day to not move from her seat on the bus because she was tired. She actually had years of training with the NAACP leading up to that action. Years of training sounds like she was the Batman of black women, trained by Ra's al Ghul to sit on buses. One thing that really bothered a professor I had was that when people discuss the Nazis they frequently label them as psychopaths, insane, crazy, etc. This is especially true with Adolf Hitler. When discussing him, people right off the bat label him as evil, a monster, a drug addict, had one testicle, basically any reason to distance Hitler from a normal human. You can't just dismiss what happened in Nazi Germany as craziness. There were rational people making decisions and running the country. My professor would call us out on it, and ever since then I notice it a lot and it irks me too. Pabst Blue Ribbon Beer claims that it got the name by winning the Blue Ribbon for Best Beer at the World's Columbian Exposition, the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. There were no blue ribbons awarded at that fair. That Titanic was in any way badly designed, badly built, or badly operated by the standards of the time. In fact, there are so many ridiculous inaccuracies surrounding Titanic that it's hard to list even a fraction of them here. She was an incredibly seaworthy ship, much more so than any passenger ship around today. The iceberg tore a gash almost a third of the way down her side, and she still stayed afloat for more than 2 hours. In that time, all but 2 of her lifeboats were launched. There wasn't time to launch anymore. She could have had 100 more lifeboats on board, but that wouldn't have helped without vastly more crew to operate them. Titanic's passengers genuinely did believe that she was practically unsinkable. When the time came to begin loading the lifeboats, many passengers thought they would be safer staying on Titanic. There wasn't time for the crew to wait around convincing more people to get in, so when a lifeboat was ready, if there was no one else waiting to get in, it had to go. This is why so many of Titanic's lifeboats left only half full. Titanic wasn't traveling too fast for the conditions, by the standards of practice around at the time. Further precautions were put into practice after the incident, but no one on board can be blamed for doing what anyone on any ship would have done the same. She wasn't built using substandard materials. This rumor goes around a lot these days because of an article that was written some time ago. What the article is supposed to mean is that there is much better quality steel available today. This was not the case in 1909. Additionally, Titanic's builders were paid on a fee plus materials basis. They were given a set fee to construct the ship, plus the cost of all materials used. There was no incentive to use anything but the best steel they could get their hands on. The shipyard had an excellent reputation and would not risk tainting it by using bad steel, which could easily be noticed on inspection anyway. Titanic and her two sister ships Olympic and Britannic were also surprisingly maneuverable for their size, much more so than was expected. Some will tell you that Titanic's rudder was too small, but this simply isn't true. In fact, Olympic's wartime captain marveled at her maneuverability and was even able to throw her into a sudden turn, ramming and sinking a German U-boat. Olympic was the only merchant vessel throughout the First World War recorded to have sunk an enemy vessel. Galileo's models at the time of the controversy were less accurate than the geocentric models for predicting movement of celestial bodies, important for navigation. There was ample reason to be skeptical. The Catholic response was primarily because he decided to insult the Pope, his patron, not his scientific views. Church views on the geocentric system were largely based on Greek models, not the scripture. Since his parody of the Pope was done within his works advocating heliocentrism, the church requested he cease to publish them but allowed to publish about other scientific subjects. He agreed to do so. He later broke that promise, leading to the famous trials. It wasn't a war against science, it was politics. That Napoleon was tiny. He was actually above average height. This mistake is due to the fact that French inches were different from English inches, I believe. That people in the Middle Ages used spices to mask the flavor of meat that had gone bad. If you could afford spices that were traded from far off lands at great expense, you could well afford fresh meat. The idea that Columbus was trying to prove that the earth was round, or that anyone in that time period even believed that the earth was flat. Mark Twain did not say, "The coldest winter I ever spent was a summer in San Francisco." I've seen quite a few quotes attributed to him that are really of unknown origin. I think because of his wide range of writings it is easy to claim he wrote something. The Vikings never wore horns on their helmets. The only reason we believe that is because of poems and tales of the Vikings saying they did so. We found remains of Vikings and non-horned helmets after the idea that they had horns on their helmets was popularized. Just think about it, aren't horns on a helmet a little impractical and inconvenient? You would never use them, and it would make a great handle for the enemy to drag your head to the floor. That people who lived before modern medicine lived much shorter lives. When we say that the average life expectancy of an individual in say the year 1100 was 35, it does not mean that most people lived to around 35 and then suddenly died. It means that mainly due to high childhood mortality and death during childbirth rates, the average age of death was driven down. If you survived childhood and pregnancy, you had a fairly good chance to live well into your 60s or 70s. Of course, people died more often from diseases and malnutrition, but these were marginal factors in reducing the average life expectancy compared to childhood mortality and death during childbirth. Pocahontas and John Smith. Thanks to Disney, no one remembers that Pocahontas was a 12-year-old girl that was kidnapped by a 30-plus-year-old man, dragged from her home, and killed by STD. She didn't die from an STD. It is not known what caused her death, but theories range from smallpox, pneumonia, or tuberculosis, to her having been poisoned, none of which are STD related. That a katana is somehow the best sword humanity ever created and that the samurai were the best swordsmen. Bullshit. The katana is great, assuming you are fighting in Japan. As soon as you hit somewhere with metal armor, specifically Europe, that sword actually kind of sucks. Also, when you break down sword fighting among all the major sword cultures, Europe, Japan, China, some parts of India, 75% of it is the same crap, mostly with variances in footwork. Europeans could handle a sword just as well as the Japanese. The exemption of the American-Philippine War from lower levels of history classes. I didn't even hear about it, much less learn about it until I took an AP class. The common American myth that Jesse James was an American Robin Hood. Jesse James was a fiery rebel who killed unarmed and innocent people who posed no threat to him and robbed Southern as well northern banks and trains. Jesse's murderer is frequently referred to as the coward Robert Ford, while Ford did shoot him while facing his back. Jesse James once shot an innocent man named John Sheets who was merely filling out a bank slip. Jesse James never gave any money back to people who needed it or really had any chivalrous qualities other than deluding himself that he was a Southern gentleman. Truth is that Jesse James was domestic terrorist who stole and victimized dozens of people, killed innocents and aggrandized himself by stealing the success of others. As someone from the UK, I think people forget about how crappy the country has acted over centuries. We're obviously not the root of all evil, but people forget. We seem to celebrate the abolition of slavery and look at the US as the ones with slaves, when we'd been carting slaves around the world for a substantially long time. Having a huge empire might have sounded quite cool and civilizing, but we were pretty awful in some cases, especially with how we treated the Aborigines. The Tories seem to want to bring back the pride in the history of the empire, but it's something we should look at far more objectively. As a Dutchman, we were also pretty cruel to the natives in our colonies. We also transported slaves around the world. The relative scope of World War II on the Western Europe front versus the Eastern Front. People never understand or are even taught the sheer magnitude and difference. Americans are taught as if we basically were what won the war in Europe. It's pretty dang misleading. That there were 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, there was pretty much every other Greek city-state there at the time. Sparta fielded one of the smallest armies there and reluctantly went to war because they initially wanted to stay behind on their little peninsula. Even after crap hit the fan and the rest of the Greeks retreated, there were still 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans as well as the 300 Spartans that fought to the last. What really rustles my jimmies about it is that the Spartans couldn't be seen retreating. They had to fight by the morals and laws they had drummed into them. The Thebans and Thespians just stayed behind because they had gonads of steel, even though in those days they were more of a militia than trained soldiers like the Spartans, and they get zero recognition. That people say Hitler killed 6 million people. He killed 6 million Jews. He killed over 11 million people in camps and ghettos. However, Japan killed more Chinese than Hitler killed Jews. Everything was better in the 1950s. History buffs of Reddit, what is one of the most fascinating stories you've learned that no one seems to talk about and can't be found in textbooks? I wish more people realized how truly post-apocalyptic life after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire was. In Britain, we had large cities made of masonry, aqueducts, running water, lawyers and accountants, central heating, financial derivatives, or thriving civilization. After the collapse, we lost all of that. The plumbing and concrete broke down. Nobody knew how to fix it. People built mud huts inside old stadium and amphitheaters, using them as forts. That's some Diamond City crap there. It took centuries for the economy to recover to the point that currency was needed again, rather than bartering. A side point, back in the day, York and Thebes were in the same country. That still blows my mind. Plus people had to leave cities because they weren't safe. Most cities and villages didn't have massive fortifications and they were the first place most barbarian nomads stopped to loot. The May incident in World War II. American submarines were very good at getting away from Japanese surface ships. This was because the Japanese thought American submarines could only reach a much shallower depth than they actually could, and they never set their depth charges to these deeper depths. Congressman Andrew May decided it would be a good idea to hold a press conference announcing this fact. From then on, the Japanese set their depth charges to these deeper depths. Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, commander of the US submarine fleet in the Pacific, estimated that May's security breach cost the United States Navy as many as 10 submarines and 800 crewmen killed in action. He said, "I hear Congressman May said the Jap depth charges are not set deep enough. He would be pleased to know that the Japs set them deeper now. Loose lips sink ships." When Ivan III of Russia married Zoe Sophia Paleologina, niece of Dragaces Paleologus or Constantine XI, her uncle gifted them a library along with many other treasures. This library somehow survived the burning of Moscow in 1493 and continued to be passed down to her son, Vasily III, and then on to her grandson, Ivan IV. During Ivan IV's reign of terror, the second half of his reign, he feared the library was too precious a treasure and worried it would be stolen. So he and a few men took the collection out of Moscow, what was most likely a 1-3-day horse ride, and buried the books, possibly in a vault. To ensure the location of the library would never get out, he had the men killed. Ivan IV died before the location of the library was ever revealed. We have no idea what could have been in this library or if the contents have even survived, though some historians have speculated that Plato's Hermocrates, the final dialogue pertaining to Atlantis, could have been part of the collection. There's no proof that this is true. Welp, time to go to Russia and buy me a shovel. It's a bit more recent, but I love the story of Gander. After 9/11 all the planes were grounded. Almost 7,000 people, which was about 66% of the local population, were forced to land in this tiny town of Gander, Newfoundland. The whole town worked together to make sure all the passengers would have everything they needed. The local ice rink was filled with frozen food that people donated. You couldn't find a closed door in town for stranded people to take a shower or just talk. Once the grounding of planes was lifted, those passengers pooled their money together and created a scholarship for the people of Gander to use. This is one of the greatest acts of kindness that I can view in history. To this day, Gander is the only place outside the United States where they have a piece of the World Trade Center. In World War II, there was a Spanish spy named Joan Pujol Garcia who approached the Allies to work for them. When they refused, he approached the Nazis, and they accepted him, giving him the codename Arabelle. Once he earned credentials working as a Nazi spy, he approached the Allies again, this time getting a job as a double agent, codenamed Garbo. This is where it gets unbelievable. He fed the Germans a combination of misinformation, true but useless information, and high-value information that always got to the Germans just a little too late. He even started a spy network consisting of 27 subagents of his own. Keep in mind that not a single one of these subagents existed. They were completely imaginary, but regardless, he submitted expense reports for them and had the Nazis giving him money to pay their salaries. At one point, when he had to explain why some high-value information got to the Germans late, he told them that one of his spies had died. He actually got the Germans to pay the imaginary spy's imaginary wife a very real pension for her loss. Not only did his false information get the Nazis to waste millions of dollars, but he was also instrumental in convincing the Nazis that the attacks on D-Day were just a diversion, and the real attack was yet to come, keeping vital German resources away from the front lines. He is one of the only people to ever get an Iron Cross from the Germans, which required Hitler's personal authorization, since he wasn't a soldier, and an MBE from King George VI. The Battle of Attu. It was the only battle of World War II fought on US soil. Attu is an island in the Aleutians. The Japanese invaded it intending to, who the heck knows, it was far too remote to serve as a staging for an invasion of the mainland. The American soldiers who were sent there had originally been slated to go to North Africa. They were sent to the Arctic in the spring, with gear meant for fighting in the desert. They lost more men to the elements than to the Japanese. I am a nurse and a few years ago I had a resident who was in this battle. To his dying day he was reluctant to talk about it, even 70 years later. What I shared here is all he would tell me. So during the Spanish-American War, right after it broke out, the US Pacific Fleet got wind that the Spanish had their Pacific Fleet sitting in Manila Bay in the Philippines. So the US fleet sails from Hong Kong to go attack them, and along the way a British fleet saw them headed full steam somewhere and figured they must be headed for a battle. Well, since there were no training videos or simulations in 1898, the best way to get experience was to either be in a battle or watch one, so they followed along behind the Americans to see what was going to happen. Well, as they continued on, a German fleet saw them as well and made the same decision the Brits did and followed along to watch. It's important to mention here that the US ships were the best of the time. Only the British had similar ships, and these new US ships were the best in the world, though low in number. So on top of the spectacle of a battle, everyone wanted to know how they would perform. So finally the Americans get to Manila Bay and find the Spanish still at anchor in the harbor. So they sail up and blockade it. Morning comes and the Spanish wake up to find the harbor blocked by 6 of the best ships money could buy at the time, and past them an assortment of British and German ships and a couple reserved ships from the US fleet. Well, the Spanish, having no idea what the heck is happening, refused to surrender, and unfortunately for them the American guns were longer range, so they just sat out there and absolutely destroyed them while Spanish shells splashed in the water hundreds of feet away. They fired 6,000 shells at the Spanish. In the end, virtually the entire Spanish fleet was either at the bottom of the harbor or so damaged it was useless. 75 men were dead and hundreds wounded, and the only major naval force the Spanish had in the Pacific Ocean was done for. The US side had a handful of injuries and only one fatality, which was an old engineer who succumbed to heat stroke during the battle. Diarrhea was so widespread and common in the 19th century that people would develop opium habits because opium makes you constipated. Opium has probably prevented millions of deaths from diarrhea. I crap you not. Two of my favorite are the Attack of the Dead Men and the Brown-Stigler incident. The Attack of the Dead Men occurred during in 1915 World War I when the Germans laid siege to the Russians in Osawik fortress in modern Poland. First the Germans shelled the fort and attacked the Russians held. During the second attack the Germans used heavier artillery guns to destroy the fort. Once again the Russians repulsed the attack. The third time the Germans used a combination of artillery and chlorine gas. As the German infantry advanced they heard screaming and saw Russian soldiers charging them. The Russians were covered in chemical burns, eyes red from the gas, and they were coughing up blood. Once again the Germans pulled back. The Russians evacuated the fort 2 weeks later. The Brown-Stigler incident occurred during World War II. A B-17-ye-olde pub was heavily damaged during a bombing run on Bremen. Several of its crew were killed or injured. 2 engines were out, a section of the tail was blown away, and the radio was disabled. The bomber lost altitude and was saved by the captain, Charlie Brown. The bomb flew over an airfield and was spotted by a German fighter ace Franz Stigler. Stigler took off, caught up to the bomber, had it in his sights, then realized that the tail gunner was not firing. At this point he noticed how damaged the B-17 was and took the advice of his former CO to never shoot a man in a parachute. He decided that the bomber was no longer combat capable and was in distress, like a man in a parachute. So he pulled to the side of the B-17 and signaled for Brown to land at the airfield. When Brown continued to fly, Stigler tried to get him to fly to Sweden. Once again Brown continued on. When Stigler realized that Brown was going to try to return to England he pulled to the bomber's wing and escorted to the English Channel where he gave Brown a salute to return to Germany. To make a long story short, after the war Brown found Stigler and the two became close friends until their deaths. A book was written called A Higher Call by Adam Marcos. 1014 AD, after defeating a large Bulgarian army at the Battle of Kledion, Byzantine Emperor Basil II had 99 of every 100 prisoners blinded, leaving each 100th man with one eye so that he could lead his comrades home. Upon seeing his thousands of blinded soldiers, the Bulgarian emperor reportedly died of a heart attack. Basil II was known thereafter as Basil Bulgarslayer. The story of the Bloody Benders, a family of serial killers in southeast Kansas in the 1870s. They let travelers stay and eat at their home, for a fee, of course, and would kill them during dinner, steal anything of value that the travelers had with them, and bury the bodies in the yard. More people may know about this now compared to if you had posted this question like 6 months ago, but the story of the Clotilda, the last slave ship to carry slaves from Africa to the US. The importation of slaves into the US had been outlawed by the federal government in 1808, but the international slave trade was still active. In 1859, the captain of the ship bet a rich man that he could import some slaves from Africa. He sailed that year and made it back, smuggled them into ports at night, took them up the river and then transferred them to a steamship and burnt the Clotilda. The slaves were split according to the people who fronted the money for the captain to sail and were enslaved alongside the American-born slaves and were freed after the Civil War. The captain was tried, but not convicted. The slaves settled on recovered land and founded a town called Africatown that's still there. It got launched back into the news recently because there's been a lot of attempts to find the last US slave ship and people believe that they found it a few months ago. The Bee Wars. You all know about the Soviet gulags, correct? Well, within them there became a society of criminals that organized together as thief-in-laws. In Russian, they became commonly known as the Vors. They were viciously anti-authority. They must refuse all orders and all work and spit in the face of officials. These Mathefrikers were hardcore. Well, when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, Stalin allowed prisoners to fight them on the front, in exchange for their freedom. So these guys, who are just anti-authority, were now fighting on behalf of the Soviet regime. The interesting thing though, is that these men were career criminals. So after the war, once they were free, they continued to commit crimes, and many were sent back to the gulags. Now the Vors that agreed to not fight the Nazis began to call these traitors sukas, or B in English. The sukas became a sect and were the bottom of the pyramid of the gulag's hierarchy. However, these guys were now war-hardened fighting machines. Because they took so much crap from the Vors, they eventually rebelled and the gulags were torn apart in extremely bloody battles. Literally tens of thousands of prisoners died. It was no joke, and the guards allowed them to get away with it too because it was a means of population control. Thus, the B Wars. The last American Civil War widow actually died in 2003, and the government is still paying pensions to 2 children of Civil War veterans. In case anyone is finding this hard to believe, the woman married an 81-year-old Civil War vet when she was 21 years old. She then lived to be 97. I may not be too much of a history buff, but I really like the story of Leo Major. Leo was a Canadian soldier serving in World War II. He was assigned to the division in charge of liberating the Netherlands. One day in the summer of 1944, he was alone on reconnaissance duty when he saw 2 German soldiers walking nearby. He killed one and captured the other, then captured their commanding officer and an entire German garrison after killing a couple more. He came under fire from other German soldiers and kept walking. He single-handedly captured 93 German soldiers. In February of 1945, a truck Leo was in hit a landmine. He broke his back, a few ribs, and both ankles, and was told he would be discharged. Leo couldn't give enough fricks, however, and a week later he snuck out of the field hospital he was in and stayed with a Dutch family. After getting better, he made it back into his battalion and volunteered to do reconnaissance of the city of Zwolle. Once he departed, he decided to take the city himself. He convinced a German soldier to relay a message back to the German army, then through the night ran around the town making all the noise he could. He shot bullets, threw grenades, captured German soldiers, burned down the Gestapo, and cleaned out the SS building in Zwolle. His tactics were so effective he convinced the German army that the entire Canadian army was invading the town. So by the morning the town was free of Germans and the Canadian army just marched in. He has a street named after him in that town now. The Battle of Sarajevo. 21 British Sikh soldiers were attacked by 10,000 Afghans. All the Sikhs fought to the death and brought down a lot of Afghans. It, deservingly, should be considered one of the greatest last stands of all time. I recently finished Killers of the Flower Moon, which was a piece of interesting history about the systematic murders of the Osage Indians around the 1920s in Oklahoma. Without going into every little detail, the Osage Indians were given head rights over land that contained oil. They were essentially given royalties for miners to come and mine for oil. It actually ended up making them the wealthiest people per capita at the time. Of course, some white folk weren't too impressed and then started systematically murdering them so that the head rights would be passed on to a relative whom happened to have a white husband, as he would be allowed to legally take possession of the head rights. It was investigated many times with nothing turned up until Hoover decided to take a much bigger vested interest in the case and assign a team to handle it. It was a pretty important case as it gave Hoover the impetus to increase the size of his department and implement new ideas as a framework moving forward for the future Department of FBI. I think it was called Dodge at the time. Anyways, I hadn't heard about this and never knew just how much these people went through at the hand of common white folk around them at the time. Very interesting read and highly recommend it. Robert Liston 1794 to 1847, a surgeon. In fact, he was described as the fastest knife in the West End and could amputate the leg in 2.5 minutes. The faster the surgery, the more likely the recovery. Though during this particular amputation he went so quickly he also removed his patient's testicles. However, he also amputated a man's leg in less than 2.5 minutes, who would later die of gangrene. In his haste, he accidentally cut off his assistant's fingers, who would later die from gangrene, and, apparently, cut through the coattails of a surgical spectator, who was so scared he died of fright, this becoming the only surgery with a 300% mortality rate. We British did try opening trade by negotiation, but sometimes we did it very, very badly. 1793, Beijing, Qing Empire, McCartney Embassy, Britain's first attempt at negotiating with the Qing. The party arrived with no prior warning or arrangement with the royal household or the court of the Qing, and at a time while the emperor was in a different palace, so not expecting guests. The Qianlong emperor still agreed to meet them though, and was quite impressed by the 10-year-old boy they brought along, who could speak fluent Chinese. Just, none of the adults could speak Chinese, or Manchu, or any language that was used in the Qing court. So the court ran around trying to see if anyone could speak English in the court. Literally only one person in the Qing court could, the Grand Secretariat Hessian, who was occasionally absent from court due to illness. The negotiating didn't go too badly between McCartney and Hessian, though Hessian did have a bout of illness while at the table, which it turns out was caused by a hernia the guy had for over 20 years, which McCartney's physician actually helped with, putting them in a pretty good position for once. Then there was the issue of the kowtow, which McCartney would not do to Qianlong as it would be disrespectful to the British king to bow more respectfully to a foreign emperor. That took a lot of negotiating around, with the conclusion that McCartney would show Qianlong the same respect that he would show the British king, which offended the court, but the emperor was fine with after explanation. The result of the comedy of errors? Qianlong sending a letter to the king rejecting trade offers. However, not as some think due to this mess and offending the court and stuff, but just because he didn't want to trade with them. A Dutch party did everything right and they were still rejected. What historical fact blows your mind? London Underground opened during the American Civil War. Freaking explains why 6 feet 3 inches me can't fit in the dang thing properly. That at the same time the US Civil War was going on, which killed about 600,000 people and served as probably our greatest national tragedy, China was in the throes of the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion is the largest civil conflict in human history, and best estimates put the death toll somewhere north of 20 million. Really reminds you of just how many more people live in Asia. Also, Hong Xiuquan, who led the rebellion, claimed he was Jesus' younger brother. The number of aircraft destroyed during World War II is greater than the number of aircraft that currently exist in the entire world today. Of course it is. The number of destroyed planes has thousands of zeros in it. In the late 1800s, writers complained that young adults are losing touch with reality. Instead of sitting at the dinner table with family, they have their noses buried in a magazine. In the late 1800s, music paper producers claimed that illegally copying sheet music would destroy the entire music industry. A man survived both atomic bombs in Japan. After being shot during a duel, Andrew Jackson lived with a bullet next to his heart for 39 years. Jackson was shot first and calmly kept his composure and ended up killing the man. When speaking to an astonished friend after the incident, he stated, "If he had shot me through the brain, sir, I should still have killed him." Lead poisoning would explain much of his behavior. How deplorable the conditions were just being in the Royal Navy in the 17th century. You would work in disgusting, stupidly dangerous conditions, had more than a 50% chance of dying, and after 3 years of this they would find an excuse not to pay you at all. This is why a lot of them became pirates. There was a saying that the only difference between prison and the Navy is that in the Navy you might drown too. That the Romans and the Chinese knew about each other and actually communicated semi-regularly. The Chinese called the Romans Dakin and envisioned them as a kind of mirror China on the other side of the world. It is believed that the human population dipped as low as 1,000 people about 70,000 BCE. We could very well have been a few stillbirths or saber-tooth maulings away from extinction. When reduced to such low numbers, the survival of a species truly teeters on a knife's edge. It's a difference of a handful of births, too few and you dip below minimum viable population. Our survival could have come down to something as trivial as some tribe finding a spring or gazelle in the nick of time. Yes, it's thought that extremes of climate in Eastern Africa forced humans to divide into small, isolated groups. We came back from the brink, reunited, and populated the world. Crap's crazy. The last execution by guillotine was after the first Star Wars movie. Bear in mind that, when invented, it was by far the most humane method of execution out there. Epcot, the entire theme park at Walt Disney World, was built in 3 years. It takes longer to get new shopping plazas finished today, largest construction job in the world at the time. I wonder how much of a role the fact that it was Disney played in that. Like, shopping plazas need to deal with zoning and all sorts of other things. I teach history at a high school and I realized today that we've been using guns in war for close to 600 years. Also sort of poetic to think that the world's first giant artillery weapon, the Dardanelles gun, ended the Roman Empire. Kind of poetic with the advance of technology in this classical empire being destroyed by the first early modern siege. Just learned this in my history class today. There are no more living veterans of World War I, but there are still 20,000 alive widows of World War I veterans. It's estimated that Genghis Khan killed approximately 40 million people in his lifetime. It's also estimated that when he slaughtered the city of Urgench, he killed over 1 million people in approximately 6 months. He had a habit of conquering a city, rounding up all the prisoners, then dividing the prisoners by the number of people in his army and giving each soldier that number of people to march off and behead. America was 1 vote off from importing hippos. The loss of life in the world wars, around 38 million in World War I and around 60 million in World War II. Just thinking about how catastrophic and damaging that must have been for people and communities is something I just can't comprehend. In World War I, buddy battalions were common in Britain, where they would recruit and keep men together from local areas, the idea being that the connection would help morale and bring them together. Just looking at the dead from the Battle of the Somme, 72,000 plus people died from the UK and Commonwealth, entire battalions wiped out, entire villages and towns losing all their men and boys, hundreds of families who knew each other, who all on the same day find every recruited soldier from that area has died. The loss must have been unimaginable. The last American Civil War widow's pension was paid in 2003. There was also a Confederate soldier that tried going to a veterans hospital in the 1950s. They originally wouldn't treat him because he wasn't a United States veteran. I should clarify that they did end up treating later though, he was just originally denied. That the Roman Empire existed for over 2,000 years in one form or another, and there were people calling themselves Romans until the 1800. Even after that, nations and rulers laid claim to the mantle of Rome, well into the 20th century. 1. Julius Caesar was once kidnapped by pirates. He laughed at the ransom they were demanding and ordered them to increase it. He made them listen to his poetry and berated them if they complained. He threatened to crucify them, and once he was set free he did just that. 2. Olga of Kiev. Her husband was murdered by a rival tribe. Said tribe tried to get her to marry one of their men and she agreed. She invited them over and had her servants dig a hole and burn the visitors alive. Then she sent pigeon and sparrows with sulfur tied to their legs into the village and burned it to the ground. She was a bad bee. I'm glossing over all of this. I could be wrong, but this is what I remember. Julius Caesar was once kidnapped by pirates. He laughed at the ransom they were demanding and ordered them to increase it. He made them listen to his poetry and berated them if they complained. He threatened to crucify them, and once he was set free he did just that. Till that JC was a vogan. I, through the power of the internet, have seen more naked women than all my ancestors combined. Yeah, but they have seen actual women naked. Pluto didn't even get to complete one orbit around the sun between the time it was discovered and the time it was declassified as a planet. Pluto was discovered in 1930, that 87 years ago. It has an orbital period of 248 years. Pluto has only completed 35% of its orbit since being discovered. Alexander the Great defeated Darius I of the Persian Empire, the largest empire in the world at the time, by beating them in the field in open combat. And he did it twice. In the first battle, he was outnumbered 7-1. In the second battle, he was outnumbered 10-1. And he freaking decimated the Persians. And he conquered and ruled one of the largest empires in history. He was 32 when he died. I'm 32 and still feel like I'm too young to have kids. Germany paid off the last of its World War I reparations in 2010. At the Battle of Monte Cassino in 1944, The 222nd Artillery Supply Company under the Polish 2nd Corps had a bear named Wojtek that would bring artillery shells to forward gun positions. Let me repeat that. A motherfucking bear would fetch them artillery shells. Not only did John Adams and Thomas Jefferson die within hours of one another, it was on the 4th of July, the 50th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson died first and Adams' last words were "Jefferson lives," since the news didn't reach him yet. More bombs were dropped on the country Vietnam during Vietnam War than were dropped throughout the entirety of World War II across the globe. That the Mongols lost to the Japanese in 2 invasions, both times due directly to a typhoon. Thanks, Bill Wirtz. Gunboats. The last person born in the 1800s just died. Unless you live to 2100s, you're never going to meet a person who has lived in 3 centuries. This person lived through World War I, World War II, Vietnam, 9/11, Titanic, Jim Crow laws and their repeal, Prohibition and its repeal, women's rights, especially voting, the rise of flappers, the rise of twerkers, the Great Depression, the moon landing, the Dust Bowl, rock and roll, hippies, pop, rap, electro, Frank Sinatra, Elvis, the Beatles, Michael Jackson, Babe Ruth, Muhammad Ali, every Super Bowl, every World Series, Kennedy's assassination, television, remotes, airplanes, the internet, cell phones, virtual reality video games, man-made drugs, the end of Prussia, the rise and fall of Czechoslovakia, the end of the Soviet Union, the end of Ottoman Empire, and the creation of 5 states. Not to mention that when they were born they were the youngest person, and when they died as the oldest person, there was a completely different set of people on the planet than when they were born. This person lived through some of the most significant moments in human history. Truly blows me away. I mean, if I make it to 101, I'll have lived in 3 different centuries. I am in my early 20s. When my grandmother was a child, living in the South, an elderly neighbor would tell grandma about how when she was herself a little girl, she remembered seeing the Confederate troops march by in the Civil War. It's so strange to think that an event which seems so distant really happened within 2 human lifespans. Born in 1790 at the start of the French Revolution, John Tyler still today has 2 living grandchildren. That humans have been around for about 200,000 years, but we only have written records dating back 6,000. 97% of humankind's history is lost. I mean, most of said history was after a long day of walking around and looking at stuff. Gert got his dong stuck in a hornet's nest again. The first person to use the phrase "what the Dickens" was Shakespeare. I thought it was referencing Charles Dickens. I never understood why people said "it hurts like the Dickens." I always thought it was referring to his writing style of one of his books. The ancient Phoenicians had a number system that went from 1 to 60. For them to write 61, they would have written 11. The same people invented the measurement of the circle and decided that there are 360 degrees around the circle. The Boy Scout handbook says if you hold your hand out at arm's length, 1 finger width is about 1 degree of arc circle measurement. Till there are societies alive today that don't have any number system. They think with the concept of a few or many. That Oxford University is older than the Aztec civilization. That Cambridge University is older than the Easter Island heads. And that Oxford is so old no one knows when it was actually founded. They only know people were teaching there as of 1096, but don't know how long that had been going on. 189 Swiss Guard defending the Holy See in 1527. 10,000 Protestant mercenaries sacked the Vatican. The Vatican defenders were some militia and the Swiss Guard. All but 42 Swiss Guards sacrificed their lives to get the Pope to safety. Not to mention that they still guard the Vatican to this day, and that the Vatican is the only state allowed to use Swiss mercenaries. What is estimated to be the first written record of an encounter with Vikings essentially goes like this. There are some small ships approaching our little island with a monastery on it. I wonder who it will be. Their boats looks different than ones I've seen before. Hello friends, welcome to our AHHHHH. No, everything is gone. We're all hurt. The buildings are burning. And they didn't even speak to us. It probably was more along the lines of, Taroint longa bega drudimaren oilen begla ministeraire, enfhedera bise, oen bide breathnari and afraril nana sin male officerilos, dear do it cared file troima, ahhhhh, neeel. If you are 25 years old, you have lived through more than 10% of the history of the United States of America. When I was 18, my hometown celebrated 700 years and it is far from the oldest town in Europe. Dublin recently turned 1000 Ike. Hitler was a dispatch runner in World War I. He came face to face with the enemy, but his life was spared. I believe he eventually even sought out the British soldier who had spared his life. I feel bad for that guy. At the time he did the right thing, but in the long term killing Hitler would have probably saved tens of millions of lives. 10th US. President John Tyler, born in 1790, has 2 living grandchildren. It blows my mind that we first used a nuclear weapon, the peak form of weaponry, for battle purposes 72 years ago and haven't used it since. In a war that had bolt-action rifle and horses. Photography is almost 200 years old. The fact that we have photos of slaves proves humanity develops at an odd pace. Food, the way we eat today, particularly the variety, is completely unheard of historically. The main thing I like to remind people is even 100 years ago you'd go to your local market and buy and eat the plants that are in season. Imagine if you went to get a cheeseburger and they told you they didn't have tomatoes because it's not tomato season, you would look at them like they are crazy. But if you did the same thing during most of human history and demanded a crop that was out of season, they would look at you like you're the crazy one. Anne Frank and MLK were born in the same year. And Barbara Walters. I'm not sure if you could call it a historical fact or just a thought on history, but it's absolutely insane to me to think how fast computers have injected themselves into our lives. I was talking to my father about it. He was born in the 50s and to your everyday working Joe like his father they weren't even a concept or a thought. It's weird to think that in a span of 25-35 years is when computers just started to become used in businesses more regularly. Thinking about that time span is wild. My father, in his mid-60s, was my age when computers first started to become mainstream. His grandma, my great-grandma, shared a community line with everyone around the farming area. Now almost everyone carries around miniature computers that power our ability to communicate, read about and perceive the world. My nieces and nephews can navigate YouTube, something I don't think my mid-60s mother can do with any real skill. 117 years ago the concept of a computerized device allowing you to communicate with anyone in the touch of a few buttons would be science fiction. And going back even further, it'd start to become straight up witchcraft or sorcery. Watch, peasants from the 1750s, as I conjure on my device the image of individuals engaging in obscene acts. Hitler had never been to a concentration camp. This made my eyebrows shoot up quite dramatically. I want to look into this further, but also I really don't. What are some weird historical facts or events that most people don't know about? As a child, Queen Victoria was isolated and emotionally abused by her mother and her mother's scheming friend Sir John Conroy. They hoped to make the young Victoria, the heiress presumptive, weak-willed and dependent on them, so that they could control her when she became queen and be the power behind the throne. Obviously this didn't work. It did exactly the opposite of working. The only reason King Tut is considered famous is because his tomb was one of few untouched by tomb robbers because he was that unimportant. All major pharaohs had their tomb robbed and Tut's was the first tomb discovered during the time with everything intact. He wasn't an influential or all that memorable pharaoh of his time. King Tut is to King Edward VI of England, too young to rule and died too early to be effective. I think the most fascinating part about this is that his tomb still had intricate artifacts that, to us, are incredibly ornate. I cannot begin to imagine what was in an important pharaoh's tomb. Before the mid-19th century, dentures were commonly made with teeth pulled from the mouths of dead soldiers. Peter the Great executed his wife's lover, then forced her to keep her lover's head in a jar of alcohol in her bedroom. Peter don't mess around. Thomas Jefferson had ram as a pet. He called it the abominable animal. It was aggressive as heck, and Jefferson usually tied it outside buildings he was in, and it attacked a lot of people just walking by. It killed a boy even. He only had it killed once it started attacking his other sheeps. WTF Thomas. Gladiators endorsed products like modern sports stars do. Eastern spices taste so good. Albert Einstein could have been president of Israel when it was formed, but he declined. Classics Sheen. A spiritualist who believed in harnessing orgone, as in orgasm, energy sent Einstein what is fundamentally a nonsense machine for harnessing the energy. Einstein spent an afternoon trying to analyze this thing before sending an apologetic letter explaining that this machine was just nonsense. The first vibrator. Benjamin Franklin wrote an essay about farts. And another about how young men should sleep with old women. 26th President Theodore Roosevelt was an ardent supporter of William Howard Taft. The two were longtime friends, and Taft was Roosevelt's most trusted cabinet member. When Roosevelt's latter term came to a close, he successfully campaigned for Taft's election to the presidency. However, when Taft began enacting many policies that his predecessor found disagreeable, Roosevelt grew sour towards his friend. He vied for the Republican presidential nomination and failed. He then literally marched his supporters out of the Republican convention hall and created a new party. Under this new party's banner, Roosevelt split the Republican vote and ensured Taft's defeat. The Bull Moose Party. Teddy didn't take no bull. Thomas Jefferson collected so many books in his lifetime that he would go into debt. After the British burned Washington, D.C. in the Battle of 1812, he sold most of his books to the Library of Congress to replace those that were lost in the fire. Jefferson had spent 50 years accumulating a wide variety of books in several languages and in many subjects, including philosophy, science, literature, architecture, law, religion, and mathematics. The nearly 6,500 books netted him $23,950. On the Lewis and Clark expedition, a vote regarding what direction they should go was held on the coast of Washington amongst the party members. This vote included Sacagawea and York, Lewis' slave. Thus, because the expedition was funded by the US military, this was the first time in American history where a woman and black man were allowed to participate in a vote of any kind related to government affairs. Legend holds that the Renaissance artist Raphael died of exhaustion and fatigue due to excessive fornication with his mistress, Fornerina, Madame TSS. Hitler's original plan for the Jewish was to deport them to Madagascar. When that failed for obvious reasons, mass forever sleep was the backup. Over 1/3 of the men who served in the Waffen-SS were neither German nor ethnic German. Common or ethnic German. I think it's pretty safe to say that none of the people who served in the Waffen-SS were very ethical people. The sound made by the Krakatoa volcanic eruption in 1883 was so loud it ruptured eardrums of people 40 miles away, traveled around the world 4 times, and was clearly heard 3,000 miles away. That's like you standing in New York and hearing a sound from San Francisco. You didn't have to be ethnically Spanish to be a conquistador. There were conquistadors from England and Germany, but the rules to become one involved Hispanicizing your name and converting to Catholicism if you weren't already Catholic. Hernando de Soto is responsible for the collapse of several North American civilizations and the death of untold millions of people. He, and his band of men, were the first Europeans to make a concerted expedition into what's now the USA. He started in Florida and eventually his men made it to Louisiana, with many detours along the way. De Soto dies along the way, but that's unimportant. What's important is that they brought about 300 pigs with them for food because they breed quickly and can live off of almost anything. Unfortunately, they also serve as a host for various diseases that humans are susceptible to. Lots of the pigs escaped, reproduced, destroyed farmland, and spread diseases. By the time the next Europeans came to those areas, the civilizations De Soto and his men saw had utterly collapsed and the population had catastrophically fallen as well. Similarly, the vast numbers of buffalo and passenger pigeons are thought to be a result of the death of North American native peoples and the collapse of their civilizations. particularly the ability to maintain agricultural systems. That's also thought to be tied to a period of global cooling as an entire continent's worth of people stopped using fire to control plant growth and forests expanded massively, resulting in vast amounts of CO2 being pulled from the atmosphere. Magellan is not the first person to circumnavigate the globe. He never made it. He died in the Philippines. There was a 100-hour war between El Salvador and Honduras in 1969. The war caused the death of about 3,000 people. The war was triggered by a soccer game. It has been known as the Football War. And we still hate each other to this day. Also, I love your username. It is common practice to wear the bottom button of a vest waistcoat undone. Sometimes, vests are even cut with the bottom edge curving away so that the button is purely decorative. The reason for this is that Edward VI of England was a fatus. He undid his bottom button for gut comfort, and it turned into the style as courtiers imitated him. Relatedly, the fashion of wearing wigs, which prevailed in European fashion for 150 years, started because the French king got bald and needed one. The Roman Senate of the Roman Republic wasn't officially supposed to be a legislative body with authority to pass laws. Officially, it could only recommend legislation to the magistrates, who didn't technically have to obey. However, there was an extremely strong precedent to obey official advice from the Senate, so it almost always was followed during the Republican period. During the Empire, the authority of the Senate was reduced further. It's worth noting, however, that the Senate didn't only issue advice. Outside of legislative issues, they did have other authorities and powers in addition to the immense influence they carried. Something I always like to talk about, there once existed an alleged theoretical state of war that lasted 335 years and 19 days, and was between the Dutch and an archipelago off the coast of southwest England called the Isles of Scilly. What's more, there were no casualties, because the Dutch forgot that they were at war with the Isles. It wasn't until a Scilly historian contacted the Dutch about the war in 1985, and received the information that the war was still technically ongoing, that a peace treaty was signed in 1986. Just imagine if they gathered to end this war, and the leaders started arguing about who won, so much so, that a real war would break out. Fidel Castro actually wanted to be allies with America, since they were only 70 miles north, a world superpower, and Cuba desperately needed economic assistance, but because of containment and strong anti-communist sentiment, Eisenhower and Nixon both refused to meet him, so Castro turned to the other world superpower, the Soviet Union, for economic assistance, and Khrushchev welcomed him with open arms, and that's how the Cuban Missile Crisis began. Not really weird, but a fun piece of history that not many people know about is the origin of an announcer calling a horse race. On the 5th of February, 1927 in Tijuana, Mexico, there was a film being shot at the racetrack. A track official noticed the way a director was using a microphone and a loudspeaker to direct his crew and actors during the filming. The idea came to him that if he had a microphone set up in the steward's booth that led to a set of speakers, he could call the positions of the horses like a director gave direction. Later that day, he had it set up without telling any of the patrons to the track about it. When people first experienced it, they were extremely confused. Before that, people would keep track of the horses themselves with binoculars and often were unable to get a great view at certain angles. After they got used to it, they loved hearing a race being called and it became an everyday thing at that small track. Now, it's an extremely important part of modern day racing all across the world, and even people that aren't familiar with the sport know about it. During his travels in Africa, the guy that invented Jameson liquor bought an 11-year-old girl as a slave and then fed her to cannibals just to see what it was like. He sketched while they ate her. Typing hard, you sick bee. In medieval times, the accused often faced a trial by ordeal, where they were forced to stick their arm into a vat of boiling water. If their arm emerged unscathed, it was believed God protected them, thus proving their innocence. They also had a trial by iron up to the 18th century, where you had to hold a red-hot iron bar in your hand and run a specified distance. The hand would then be wrapped up and you would wait a few days. If your hand skin was corrupted when the bandages came off, then that was God deeming you guilty and you were hanged. Simpler times. The Twilight Zone was one of the first television shows to feature a nearly all-black cast on a dramatic show that was not dealing with racial issues. This was all because of Rod Serling, who was quoted in saying, "Television, like its big sister, the motion picture, has been guilty of a sin of omission, hungry for talent, desperate for the so-called new face, constantly searching for a transfusion of new blood, it has overlooked a source of wondrous talent that resides under its nose. This is the Negro actor." The episode was The Big Tall Wish, which was part of the first season of the show, and it was awarded the 1961 Unity Award for Outstanding Contributions to Better Race Relations. Pope Gregory IX called for black cats to be killed as he believed they are incarnations of Satan. The mass killing of cats increased the number of rats in Europe. The increased number of rats helped to spread the plague all throughout Europe. He also had a steam yacht called the Saucisson, which was moored off the West Indies, in which he hosted the entire England cricket team and the Balinese goddess of plenty. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams both died on the same day, the 4th of July, 1826, America's 50th birthday. Adams' last words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He was wrong. Jefferson had died hours earlier in Virginia. Max Tremel, a priest on a winter walk one day in 1894, witnessed a young boy slip through some broken ice on the river and saved the boy from certain drowning. That boy was Adolf Hitler. 10-minute lobotomies. Two methods were used. Either had to drill holes in head, or the later method that was using a metal picter was used to hammer through eye sockets. In both method a metal instrument was used to mush brain. Local anesthesia was used. The patient could go home in the same day. The doctor did a couple of thousand of these and could do multiple surgeries a day. Also, because anesthetic was costly, they just stunned the patient with an electroshock therapy machine, which was pretty commonly available. Salieri did not kill Mozart. This is a legend. Mozart drank and died in poverty. I heard that it was also a myth that he died in poverty, had a pauper's burial. Apparently a lot of money was spent on his funeral as well. I actually have something for this. During the evacuation of Dunkirk in World War II, in that moment of despair, desperation and overall bleakness, on the beach there was a workers' strike by a group of British rail workers regarding overtime. A very strange thing to happen in the face of events. Beach, I'll say. Where's this Dunkirk location with a tree? Mexico lost part of its territory in part due to the abolishment of slavery. The Romans used human urine as mouthwash. President LBJ would have highways cleared out by the Secret Service, get in a car with a 6-pack of beer, and gun it down the highway, downing beer after beer. You can leave Texas, but Texas never leaves you, lol. The first vending machine dispensed holy water. The Tulsa, Oklahoma race riot. In 1921, what was called the Black Wall Street was burned to the ground, and whites actually used machine guns on black people. And fricking airplanes. When Fort Sumter was attacked by the Confederates in 1861, no one had gotten killed from the attack, but the Confederates later had a party, for a reason I do not know, and when one of their drunk asses shot a gun, it killed one of their own. That was the only death that occurred during the 3 days of the attack on Fort Sumter. Confederates kept on partying even though they saw the man dead. The CIA made a spy cat, a cat that could lurk around and record information, that they sunk several $1 million into, and it promptly walked into traffic. The Soviets had anti-tank dogs, dogs that they strapped explosives to, that didn't want to run at the tanks for obvious reasons and frequently blew up their own forces. I always heard the Soviet anti-tank dogs failed because they were trained with Soviet tanks, so promptly ignored the enemy and went straight towards Soviet tanks, as they were trained to do. During the 16th century, Nicolas Fouquet was the Minister of Finances of France under King Louis XI. He had the castle of Vaux-le-Vicomte built for a shitload of money, and had the most rad of parties there. 16th century, they still said things like rad then. He invited the king at one of those parties, and made it the raddest of all rad parties, like top 3 raddest in France's history. Looking at all the food and fireworks and fountains and all the bling, King Louis XIV found it suspicious. Where is the money coming from? He was also very much jealous of such splendor when his own castle was mostly empty. So Louis XIV had Fouquet arrested, imprisoned, then investigated and found guilty, in that order, arrested by D'Artagnan, the guy who inspired Alexander Dumas' fourth musketeer, and then he ordered a castle of Versailles to be made even more beautiful and Vaux-le-Vicomte. First law of the 48 laws of power. American doctors were secretly sterilizing women in the 70s, in America. There was a gang war called the Great Nordic Biker War where hundreds of American bikers stole armaments from several Scandinavian military bases and terrorized the streets while killing each other. They stole the weapons originally to sell back in the States, but a bandit used an anti-tank rocket to destroy a Hells Angels clubhouse in Sweden. When the barbarians sacked Carthage, they burned and pillaged pretty much everything but the sanctuary where Saint Augustine was staying. He was on his deathbed, and the barbarians respected him so much for his influence, even though they hated the church, that they decided to leave him alone. King Tut's parents were incestuous. They were brother and sister. If your grandparents are over the age of 80, they will have lived 1/3 of US history. If you are 30, you will have lived 1/8 of US history.